I spent years digging into the chilling history of the Ouija board, and what I've uncovered is far more terrifying than you might think. Real-life hauntings, violent possessions, and sinister forces all trace back to this so-called game. If you've ever wondered what really happens when you use a Ouija board, you're about to find out, and once you learn the truth, there's no going back. Chapter 1. The board's dark origins. I started my research by diving into the origins of the Ouija board, thinking I'd just find stories of a popular parlor game, a quirky invention of a more innocent time. After all, that's how most people understand it, a harmless toy used to entertain curious minds. But the deeper I went, the more I uncovered something far more sinister. The origins of the Ouija board were not born from the need to amuse, but from something much darker: spiritualism. It was the late 1800s, and spiritualism was sweeping across America. This movement wasn't just about seances and tapping tables. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon that bridged science and the supernatural. The living wanted to talk to the dead, and mediums claimed they could make that happen. Messages from the afterlife were being passed along in darkened rooms, through channels that ranged from disembodied voices to moving furniture. But there was one glaring problem. Communication with spirits was slow, awkward, and unpredictable. People wanted something more efficient, something that would bring quicker answers from beyond. Enter the Ouija board. The name Ouija itself is shrouded in mystery, allegedly a combination of the French and German words for yes. The story goes that during an early session with the board, the name was revealed by the board itself. Whether that's true or not, the Ouija board became synonymous with the growing hunger for contact with the dead. In 1890, Ouija Board, a businessman and inventor, filed the first patent for the Ouija board. He was one of many caught up in the spiritualism craze, and along with two other men, Charles Kennard and William Fuld, set out to bring the device to the masses. Bond saw the board's potential, not just as a tool for connecting with the dead, but as a marketable product. What's interesting is that he wasn't exactly a spiritualist himself. He was more interested in profit. But as I dug deeper into Bond's history, I found his involvement went beyond just dollar signs. Elijah Bond's story took a strange turn later in his life. He died in 1921, and for many years, his grave went unmarked. It wasn't until 2007, when an odd request was made by a paranormal enthusiast, that his grave was finally given a headstone engraved with a Ouija board. As I stood in front of it, I felt an unsettling connection between his invention and the hereafter. There it was, set in stone, the very thing that had stirred the imaginations and fears of so many. A literal Ouija board marking his final resting place. The irony, the symbolism, it wasn't lost on me. This game was now forever etched into his death. But what made my skin crawl was the possibility that Bond's creation had outlived him in more ways than one. In some accounts, Bond's family experienced misfortune after misfortune, though none of it was ever officially linked to the board. Still, whispers lingered about whether the Ouija had played a part in his legacy beyond the grave. I couldn't shake the feeling that the eerie events tied to his death and burial were not coincidences. Was this game just a portal to entertainment, or had Bond opened a door that no one could ever fully close? As I continued my research, I began to notice a recurring theme with the early creators of the board. William Fuld, the man who took over the Ouija board business after Bond, was also linked to strange circumstances. In 1927, Fuld died after falling from the roof of his factory, where, ironically, he had been overseeing the production of Ouija boards. Officially, it was labeled an accident. He was supposedly adjusting a flagpole when he fell to his death. But many believe something more was at play. Fuld himself had claimed the Ouija board was responsible for his success, often crediting the device with guiding his decisions. To some, it seemed the board had turned on him, claiming his life as repayment for years of profit off the unknown. The deeper I went, the more I questioned whether these deaths were just accidents or something darker. Bond, Fuld, both men profited from the Ouija board, and both met untimely, mysterious ends. Coincidence? Maybe. But the more I uncovered, the less I believed in coincidences when it came to the Ouija. It wasn't just the deaths of these men that intrigued me. There was something far more unsettling about how the Ouija board itself had changed over time. What started as a playful tool for connecting with the dead in the spiritualist movement began to take on a more malevolent tone. As early as the 1920s, stories of possession, hauntings, and violent encounters after using the board started to surface. I stumbled upon old newspaper clippings from small towns across America where people reported strange happenings after Ouija sessions. In some cases, entire families were driven from their homes by unseen forces they believed had been summoned through the board. One story from 1922 stuck with me. A young woman in Boston was found dead after a late-night Ouija session with friends. According to witnesses, she had become obsessed with the board, using it daily to communicate with what she believed was the spirit of her deceased brother. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had grown increasingly paranoid, claiming that something was following her. The police report chalked it up to suicide, but her friends insisted she had been driven to madness by something darker. I couldn't help but wonder, was the Ouija board merely a tool, or was it something more? Something dangerous? As my research expanded, I found that mediums during the spiritualist movement often claimed they had no idea what forces they were playing with when they used the Ouija board. Some believed they were communicating with benevolent spirits, while others admitted that darker entities often slipped through. These mediums weren't always in control. What started as innocent questions to the other side frequently spiraled into something they couldn't explain or stop. I found myself drawn back to Bond's grave again and again. The headstone was there as a symbol, perhaps, but also as a warning. Standing by it, I thought about how many people have unknowingly played with forces they didn't understand. The game they marketed wasn't just a novelty, it was a key. A key to what? That's where the questions began to outnumber the answers. The Ouija board may have started as a product of the spiritualist craze, a device to entertain or comfort those seeking answers from the afterlife, but it quickly became something far more unsettling. Whether or not Elijah Bond understood the full implications of what he'd created, the truth was clear to me. This game was anything but. Chapter 2, The Patience Worth Case. One of the most chilling accounts I encountered during my investigation into the Ouija board was that of Pearl Curran, a St. Louis housewife with no formal education or literary training, who, in 1913, claimed to channel the spirit of a woman named Patience Worth. What made her story stand out wasn't just the frequency of her communications, but the extraordinary detail and historical accuracy that accompanied them, details that seemed far beyond the reach of an ordinary woman with limited resources. As I delved into her story, I found myself increasingly drawn to the mystery. Was this a carefully constructed hoax, or was something far more sinister and supernatural at play? The first time I heard of Patience Worth, I dismissed it as an old, fanciful tale from the past. But when I started to research Pearl Curran's life, I quickly realized this case was not so easily explained. Pearl had no particular interest in writing or spiritualism before her supposed encounter with Patience. She had tried using the Ouija board at the encouragement of a friend who was fascinated with contacting spirits. Pearl was initially skeptical, but soon found the planchette moving under her fingers, spelling out words that neither she nor her friend seemed to control. And then, a name appeared, Patience Worth. According to Curran, Patience introduced herself as a woman who had lived in 17th century England before immigrating to America, where she died in a violent encounter. The details of her life, as Pearl recounted them through the Ouija board, were remarkably specific, her manner of speech archaic and rich with old English flourishes. From that moment forward, Patience spoke through Pearl with astounding fluency and speed, often dictating long passages of prose and poetry without pause. As I dug deeper into the story, I found entire novels, poems, and philosophical essays that Patience had supposedly written through Pearl. What struck me immediately was the sheer volume of writing. Patience, through Pearl, had produced works that range from historical fiction to philosophical musings, all with an authenticity that bewildered literary critics of the time. The question that haunted me: how could Pearl, with her limited education and no prior experience in writing, suddenly become a literary savant? I decided to visit the archives in St. Louis, where much of Pearl Curran's original manuscripts and personal correspondence are housed. I wanted to see these documents firsthand to understand the scope of what Patience Worth had supposedly produced. When I arrived, I was greeted by boxes of handwritten papers, carefully cataloged and preserved. The sheer quantity of material was overwhelming. Thousands of pages of poetry, stories, and dialogue, all supposedly dictated by Patience through Pearl. I picked up one of the notebooks, and as I flipped through the pages, I saw that the writing flowed effortlessly, with no corrections or revisions, as though Pearl had transcribed it straight from the mind of another. What unsettled me even more was the language itself. Patience's writings were steeped in 17th century English, with vocabulary and phrasing that modern readers would find challenging to comprehend. Linguistic experts of the time had studied Pearl's work and found the language to be startlingly accurate to the period Patience claimed to be from. Yet Pearl Curran had no formal education in historical language, and no evidence suggested she had ever studied this type of writing. How could she, a housewife in the early 20th century, so convincingly channel the speech and mindset of a woman from over 200 years earlier? The skeptics of Pearl's time proposed a few explanations. Some suggested that she had latent creative talents that only surfaced through the use of the Ouija board, while others theorized that she may have been unconsciously accessing buried knowledge from books she had read in her youth. But even these explanations felt inadequate when faced with the sheer complexity and accuracy of the historical details Patience provided. I remember sitting in that archive, flipping through another manuscript, and coming across one of Patience's most famous works, The Sorry Tale. It's a sprawling novel set in ancient Palestine, chronicling the life of a young man during the time of Jesus. The descriptions of the landscape, the customs, and the intricacies of life in that era were so vivid, so detailed, that it felt as if the author had lived through those times. Yet Pearl had never traveled outside the United States and had no formal education in history or theology. As I read, I found myself questioning everything. Could this truly be the work of a long-dead spirit? Or was there another explanation, a hidden reservoir of knowledge that somehow burst forth through Pearl during these sessions? I visited old libraries, examining manuscripts from the 1600s to compare the language and phrasing to what Patience had produced. The parallels were striking. Patience's writings felt as though they belonged in another time, a time Pearl had never experienced. What intrigued me further were the accounts from those who had witnessed Pearl's sessions with the Ouija board. By all accounts, when she would sit at the board, her demeanor would change. Pearl would become almost trance-like as the planchette darted across the board, spelling out words faster than anyone could keep up with. When Patience communicated, it wasn't slow or laborious as one might expect with a Ouija board. It was rapid, fluent, as though the words were pouring directly from Patience into Pearl. But as I continued my research, I also began to see another side of the story, one that made me wonder if there was more to Patience than just a literary spirit. Some of Pearl's friends noted that while Patience's messages were usually filled with humor and wit, there were times when the spirit would become more controlling, even confrontational. One account described how Patience would insist on Pearl's attention, even interrupting her daily life to dictate stories or poems. The spirit seemed to demand more and more of Pearl, almost as if it were feeding off her energy. What I couldn't ignore were the eerie parallels between Pearl's life and the lives of other mediums who had claimed to channel spirits through the Ouija board. Many of them experienced a gradual erosion of their own sense of self as the spirit took over more of their consciousness. Was this what had happened to Pearl? Had Patience Worth become a permanent fixture in her mind, guiding her thoughts and actions beyond the Ouija sessions? Or was Pearl unknowingly tapping into something darker, something that used the guise of a historical spirit to gain control? By the time I finished my research into the Patience Worth case, I was no closer to a definitive answer, but I was left with an overwhelming sense of unease. Pearl Curran's story was no simple hoax, no parlor trick designed to entertain. The sheer complexity of Patience's writings and the historical accuracy embedded within them pointed to something much stranger. Whether it was the spirit of Patience Worth or a darker force masquerading as a literary genius, I knew one thing for sure. Pearl Curran had tapped into something beyond herself. As I left the archive and stepped into the cold air outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been in the presence of something ancient, something that had used the Ouija board not just as a tool, but as a doorway that might still be open. Chapter 3: The St. Louis Ouija Incident. The story of the St. Louis exorcism is one that most people know through the lens of pop culture. It's the true story that inspired The Exorcist, a film that terrified audiences for decades. But what many don't realize is that the case's roots are entangled with something far more mundane and seemingly harmless: a Ouija board. As I dug deeper into the story, I began to see just how closely the infamous possession was tied to the board. The details that emerged left me questioning not just the safety of using such a device, but the very nature of what it could unleash. The story begins in 1949 with a 14-year-old boy, known in the case files only by the pseudonym Roland Doe to protect his privacy. For the sake of my investigation, I had to work with limited personal details, but the records I uncovered were enough to piece together the horrifying events that followed his initial encounter with the Ouija board. It started innocently, as these stories often do. Roland was reportedly introduced to the board by his aunt, a spiritualist who enjoyed using it to communicate with what she believed were friendly spirits. She taught him how to use the board, and the two began experimenting with it regularly. But shortly after his aunt's sudden death, Roland became obsessed with contacting her through the Ouija board. His family later recalled that the boy would spend hours in his room, asking questions and waiting for the planchette to move. They didn't think much of it at the time. After all, this was just a game. What could go wrong? Within weeks, strange things began happening. Roland's family reported hearing scratching noises inside the walls of their home, like something trying to claw its way out. Furniture moved on its own, and objects seemed to levitate. Roland himself began to change. He became withdrawn and irritable, prone to violent outbursts. His behavior deteriorated quickly, and soon the family was desperate for answers. At first, they turned to doctors and psychiatrists, believing Roland's erratic behavior had a medical explanation. But the tests came back inconclusive, and Roland's condition worsened. He spoke in a guttural voice, unlike his own, and began having violent fits. His parents, devout Catholics, began to suspect that something darker was at work, something far beyond the realm of medicine. They reached out to their local priest, hoping for guidance. The priest who first visited the home quickly realized this was no ordinary case. Roland's body would contort in impossible ways, and strange markings appeared on his skin, seemingly out of nowhere. One night, while the priest was present, the boy's bed lifted off the ground, hovering for a few moments before crashing down. It was at this point that the priest recommended a full exorcism, fearing the boy was possessed by a demonic force. I visited the archives of the hospital where some of Roland's most intense exorcisms took place. Buried in a back room, hidden among boxes of old, forgotten records, I found references to the boy's case. The exorcisms themselves were performed by a Jesuit priest named Father William Bowdern and several of his colleagues. Over the course of several weeks, they attempted to rid Roland of the entity that seemed to have taken over his body. These sessions were grueling, marked by horrific physical manifestations. Roland would scream in languages he had never learned, and his body would convulse violently as the priests recited prayers. What I found even more disturbing were the journal entries written by the priests who performed the exorcism. They documented their experiences in painstaking detail. One passage in particular stood out to me, written by Father Bowdern himself. He described how, during one of the sessions, Roland began to speak in his aunt's voice, pleading for help. But then, without warning, his tone shifted, and he began laughing, a low, menacing sound that didn't belong to a child. The priests were convinced that something had used the Ouija board as a gateway, slipping through under the guise of Roland's aunt. I managed to track down a few surviving relatives of the people involved in the case. One, a distant cousin of Roland's, was willing to speak with me, though under strict anonymity. They described how the family had kept quiet about the events for decades, fearing public scrutiny. What stuck with me was their admission that, even after the exorcism was deemed successful, strange things continued to happen around Roland. His parents eventually moved the family out of state, hoping to leave the darkness behind. The cousin also shared an unsettling detail that rarely made it into the official records. They recalled that Roland's mother had found the Ouija board in the boy's room one night, shortly after the phenomena began. It was still on his bed, the planchette resting on the word yes. She had thrown it away immediately, but the damage had already been done. The family was convinced that the board had been the conduit that allowed the malevolent force to enter their lives. As I pieced together the different elements of this case, one thing became clear. The Ouija board had played a pivotal role in the boy's possession. It was more than just a trigger. It was a door, one that had been opened without understanding the consequences. The board, which had been marketed as a simple tool for contacting spirits, had unleashed something far more dangerous. The family's belief in its power to communicate with their lost loved ones had ultimately left them vulnerable to something darker. What unnerved me the most was the lack of clear answers. The exorcism, while successful in the immediate sense, had not provided any closure. Roland was free from the entity that had possessed him, but the question remained: where had it come from? And had it truly been banished, or merely pushed aside for another time, another victim? As I left the archives and walked through the quiet streets of St. Louis, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far from over. The more I learned about the Ouija board, the more I realized just how little we truly understand about its power. Roland's story was a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of possession, but about the unintended consequences of trying to communicate with forces beyond our comprehension. The Ouija board may look like a simple game, but in reality, it's a tool, a key to a door that, once opened, can never truly be closed. The St. Louis case was one of the most chilling examples of what can happen when that door is opened carelessly. It wasn't just a story of demonic possession. It was a story about how a seemingly harmless board game had set off a chain of events that no one could control. Roland Doe may have been the victim, but the real danger was the board itself and the dark forces it had allowed into his life. Chapter 4: The Enfield Poltergeist. London had a different energy. The air felt heavier here, steeped in a long history of mysteries and hauntings, and none more infamous than the Enfield Poltergeist. I arrived with a notebook full of names, dates, and headlines, but what I was most interested in were the whispers. The pieces of the story that never made it into official reports, buried in the memories of those who lived it. The Hodgson family's haunting in the 1970s has been thoroughly documented, investigated by paranormal experts, and even adapted into films. But one element of the case that's often glossed over is how it all began, with a Ouija board. I started my investigation by speaking with the locals who still remembered the case. It was easy to find people who had heard of the Enfield haunting, but harder to find those who had been close to it. The small, unassuming house at 284 Green Street stood like any other in the quiet London suburb. But once you stepped closer, knowing what had transpired within its walls, it was hard not to feel a sense of unease. As I approached the home, I couldn't help but picture the chaos that once gripped this ordinary council house. The story began in August 1977 when Peggy Hodgson, a single mother of 4, reported strange happenings in her home. Her 2 daughters, Janet, 11, and Margaret, 13, were the first to notice the disturbances. It started small, scratching noises in the walls, strange creaks and thuds in the night, the kind of sounds any old house might make. But soon, the disturbances escalated. Furniture moved on its own. Objects flew across the room with no explanation. Neighbors and even police officers witnessed the phenomenon firsthand, lending credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as hysteria or fabrication. But what most people don't realize is that before the poltergeist activity, there had been a Ouija board session, a detail often left out of retellings. The children, fascinated by ghost stories, had made a makeshift board out of paper and used it to ask questions. It seemed like innocent fun at the time, a way to pass the evening. Janet, in particular, was intrigued by the idea of contacting spirits. As I sat down with a former neighbor who had lived across the street at the time, she confirmed what I had read in obscure interviews and scattered notes from investigators. That session had been the turning point. They played with things they shouldn't have, the neighbor told me, her voice lowered as though afraid to be overheard. Once you invite something in, you can't just ask it to leave. The Ouija session took place just a few days before the more violent disturbances began. According to reports, the children had asked typical questions. Is anyone there? And waited for the planchette to move. The girls swore it did, though skeptics would say it was just their imagination. But shortly after that night, the house changed. There were knocks on the walls, always 3 in a row, as if something was answering back. Then came the heavy furniture being tossed across the room as though weightless. When I spoke to Guy Lyon Playfair, one of the investigators who worked the case, he admitted that while he and his team didn't focus on the Ouija board element, it had come up in their interviews with the family. Playfair, along with fellow investigator Maurice Gross, spent over a year documenting the haunting. Both men were adamant that something real was happening inside that house. Playfair, in particular, seemed haunted by the experience, even decades later. Sitting in the now quiet home, where the current owners had agreed to let me visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The house itself was modest, unremarkable on the outside, but once inside, I felt a weight pressing down on me, a heaviness in the air that was difficult to explain. I stood in the living room where Peggy Hodgson had witnessed her furniture move of its own accord, where witnesses saw her children being thrown across the room by invisible hands. I couldn't help but feel as if the walls themselves were holding onto the memory of those violent nights. I retraced the footsteps of the investigators, following the documented events. The haunting culminated in some of the most dramatic paranormal claims ever recorded, most notably Janet Hodgson speaking in a gruff, male voice, identifying himself as Bill, a man who had supposedly died in the house years before. Janet had no recollection of speaking in this voice, but it was witnessed by several people, including journalists from the Daily Mirror and paranormal researchers. They captured audio recordings of these incidents, which I was able to listen to in a dusty archive. Hearing Janet's unnerving voice, that deep growl, sent chills down my spine. She was a child, yet here she was, speaking with the voice of a man long dead. The skeptic in me tried to rationalize it, ventriloquism, perhaps, or a subconscious trick of the mind. But standing in the house, where so many strange events were witnessed by so many people, the logical explanations felt hollow. There were too many accounts, too many witnesses for this to be a simple case of fraud or attention-seeking. And what about the Ouija board? Had the children unknowingly opened a door to something beyond their understanding? During my visit, I spoke with another investigator who had visited the house back in the late 1970s. He was one of the few who believed the Ouija board had played a central role. It wasn't just a poltergeist, he told me. It was something darker, something that had been invited in. He explained that the pattern of disturbances was typical of hauntings that began with Ouija board sessions. First, small signs of a presence, then escalating violence as whatever was summoned tried to make itself known. The media, hungry for a sensational story, focused on the visual elements, the levitations, the disembodied voices, the flying objects. But I was more interested in the subtle beginnings, the almost forgettable details that pointed to the true cause of the haunting. The Ouija session that seemed like a game to the children may have been the spark that ignited one of the most famous paranormal cases in history. As I sat alone in the house, listening to the silence that had replaced the chaos of 40 years ago, I realized that the spirits in Enfield hadn't just been knocking on walls. They were answering a call that perhaps had been made the moment those children's fingers touched the planchette, asking, "Is anyone there?" And something had answered. Chapter 5, The Zozo Phenomenon. When I first came across the name Zozo, it felt like a fleeting reference, something easily dismissed in the sea of strange stories surrounding Ouija boards. But as I dug deeper, it became clear that Zozo wasn't just another curious detail. There was a pattern here, a disturbing one. The more I searched, the more I found that Zozo was not confined to a single story or isolated incident. The name kept appearing in forums, blogs, and personal accounts, often with terrifying consequences. This wasn't a one-off hoax or urban legend. Zozo had taken root in the lives of many people, across different times and places, all with eerily similar experiences. It started innocently enough with a few late-night web searches, but the deeper I went, the more unsettling the stories became. The name Zozo first surfaced in popular consciousness around the mid-2000s, but its origins are unclear. Some say it's been around for centuries, appearing in occult texts or ancient demonology, while others argue it's a more modern manifestation. Regardless of when it first emerged, the effects of Zozo encounters were always the same: terror, chaos, and an overwhelming sense of malevolent presence. I began reaching out to individuals who had shared their experiences online, hoping to speak directly with people who had come into contact with Zozo. The stories were strikingly similar, and the fear in their voices made it hard to remain detached. One of the first people I spoke with was a man named Greg, who had been involved in a Ouija session with friends when Zozo first made its presence known. Greg's voice trembled as he recounted the night that changed his life. "We thought it was a joke at first," he said. "We had used Ouija boards before, just for fun. But this time, something was different. The planchette moved faster than it ever had. It spelled out Zozo over and over. We didn't know what it meant, so we kept asking questions, and the board just kept going." According to Greg, after the session, strange things started happening in his home. At first, it was small, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, lights flickering. But it didn't take long for the situation to escalate. The presence in his home grew more aggressive. He described waking up in the middle of the night to find deep scratches on his arms, as if something had clawed at him in his sleep. His dog, once calm and friendly, began growling at empty corners of the room, barking at shadows that no one else could see. We stopped using the board after that first night, but it didn't matter. Whatever it was, it stayed. It was like Zozo had followed us home, Greg told me, his voice low and hesitant. For weeks, we were terrorized. It didn't stop until I finally got rid of the board and had the house blessed. Greg's story wasn't unique. As I scrolled through the various online forums, I came across countless others recounting similar experiences. Zozo would often appear early in the session, quickly taking control of the board, moving the planchette with an intensity that startled even the most seasoned users. The entity would sometimes spell out obscenities or make violent threats, filling the room with an oppressive atmosphere. The moment Zozo introduced itself, it seemed the game was over. There was no more casual communication, only fear and dread. I tracked down a woman named Sarah who had shared her Zozo encounter on a paranormal discussion board. When I reached out to her, she was reluctant to speak about it at first. It had been several years since her experience, but the trauma was still fresh in her mind. After some coaxing, she finally agreed to talk, and what she told me only added to the growing sense of dread I felt about this phenomenon. "It was me and two friends. We didn't take it seriously at all," Sarah began, her voice steady but tense. "We were just messing around. But once the planchette started moving, I got this horrible feeling. It wasn't fun anymore." Sarah's session followed the same script as so many others. The planchette spelled out Zozo, and after that, things spiraled out of control. Strange noises echoed through her house, scratching, knocking, the sounds of furniture moving in rooms where no one was present. Sarah and her friends quickly ended the session, but the activity didn't stop. She described seeing shadows darting across her peripheral vision, feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched at all times. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing over me. My dreams were nightmares, filled with this black, twisting figure. I still don't know if it was Zozo or if my mind was just playing tricks on me, but it felt real. Too real. The physical effects were just as alarming." Sarah told me about finding bruises on her arms and legs that she couldn't explain. Her cat, normally calm and affectionate, would hiss at seemingly nothing, its fur standing on end as though it sensed something sinister in the room. Eventually, Sarah sought help from a local paranormal investigator who performed a cleansing ritual in her home. After that, the activity seemed to die down, but she hasn't touched a Ouija board since. By this point, I was convinced that whatever Zozo was, it wasn't a figment of imagination or a simple hoax. The consistency of the accounts, the shared details of the encounters, and the genuine fear expressed by those who had faced Zozo made it clear that this was something much darker. I continued my search for answers, reading up on the few studies and investigations that had been conducted on the Zozo phenomenon. Some researchers suggested it could be a manifestation of collective fear, an entity born from the power of suggestion, spread by stories and reinforced by shared belief. Others believed it to be a true demonic presence, using the Ouija board as a gateway to manipulate and terrorize those who unknowingly invited in. In my conversations with Zozo's victims, one thing became clear. Once the name Zozo appeared, the board was no longer just a tool for communication. It became a portal, and whatever came through wasn't friendly. Each story I uncovered carried the same sense of helplessness, as if the participants had unleashed something they could no longer control. As I pieced together these chilling accounts, I realized that Zozo wasn't just another spirit in the vast world of the paranormal. It was something far more dangerous, something that seemed to thrive on fear and chaos. Zozo was no urban legend. It was a name that carried with it a history of darkness, and those who encountered it were forever changed. Chapter 6, The Emily Rose Case. The case of Annalise Michel, widely known as Emily Rose from the film The Exorcism of Emily Rose, was one I couldn't get out of my mind. Her story, steeped in horror and tragedy, had left its mark on anyone who dared look into it. But there was one detail that kept me awake at night, something often left out in the retelling. Before the grueling series of exorcisms that led to her death, Annalise had reportedly dabbled with a Ouija board. The more I dug, the more I realized how central that board might have been to her fate. What began as a case of epilepsy or psychological distress quickly turned into a spiritual battle that left both her family and the priests who tried to save her utterly devastated. And yet, no one talked much about that fateful experiment with the Ouija board, except in hushed whispers, as if it was a dark footnote too dangerous to dwell on. My research took me deep into court documents, interviews, and the testimonies from those who knew Annalise. The official narrative, recounted in countless books and the media, was focused primarily on her religious upbringing, her diagnosis of epilepsy, and the eventual belief by her family and the clergy that she was possessed by demons. But a strange piece of her story surfaced when I started sifting through the less publicized accounts. Mention of the Ouija board. According to a few sources I found, before her symptoms worsened, before she started hearing voices or seeing terrifying faces, Annalise had used a Ouija board during her time at school. It was supposedly a casual experiment with her friends, nothing serious, just curiosity. But that night, after the session, she complained of hearing strange noises in her dorm room. Soon after, the seizures started. As I stood outside the church where her exorcisms took place in Klingenberg, Germany, the cold air seemed to cling to me. The building, weathered and old, had a quiet power about it. Here, within these walls, Annalise had undergone 67 exorcisms over the course of 10 long months. The very stones of the church seemed to hold the weight of the suffering she endured. Yet, behind all the religious rituals and medical diagnoses, I kept returning to the Ouija board. From what I could gather, Annalise had always been a devout Catholic. She attended Mass regularly, and her faith was a major part of her identity. But like many young people, she had moments of rebellion and curiosity. The Ouija board session, although brief, seemed to have left a deep scar on her psyche. Some of her friends later recalled that after the session, Annalise was never quite the same. They noticed a change in her demeanor, something darker, more withdrawn. It wasn't long after that her visions began. Annalise would describe seeing demonic faces leering at her, hearing voices that told her she was damned and would burn in hell. The medical professionals who examined her diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition known to cause hallucinations and altered perceptions. But for Annalise, this explanation wasn't enough. She believed, and her family eventually came to believe, that she was possessed. There are chilling audio recordings from her exorcisms, which I managed to find after some persistence. Listening to them was like stepping into a nightmare. Annalise's voice, guttural, inhuman, screamed out in languages she'd never learned. In some recordings, she claimed to be possessed by multiple demons, including Lucifer himself, along with historical figures like Judas Iscariot and Nero. What struck me most was how different her voice was in these recordings, compared to her earlier interviews, where she spoke softly and gently. What terrified me wasn't just the content of the recordings, but the growing sense that the Ouija board had played a role in this. In many of the other cases I had researched, the Ouija board acted as a kind of doorway, a way for malevolent forces to latch onto people who used it. Could this have happened to Annalise? Had her innocent curiosity, her momentary flirtation with the unknown, opened the door to something that couldn't be closed? There were no clear records of what was said during that Ouija session, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had acted as a catalyst. Annalise's family and priests believed she was a victim of demonic possession. But I wondered if, through the board, she had made contact with something that wouldn't let go. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. As I delved further into the court documents from her trial, the one that would ultimately charge her parents and the priest with negligent homicide after she died of malnutrition, I saw how little attention was paid to the Ouija board. The legal battle focused heavily on whether or not Annalise had been medically neglected, but the spiritual side of her suffering was largely treated as a tragic belief held by her family and the church, not as a serious factor in her death. But for those who knew her, the spiritual explanation wasn't something to be dismissed. I managed to interview a distant relative of the Michel family who still lived in Klingenberg. She was an older woman, cautious with her words, but clearly affected by the events. Over tea in her small, cozy kitchen, she spoke of the darkness that followed Annalise in her final years. She was always a sweet girl, the woman told me. But after that time, with the board, something changed. It was like she wasn't Annalise anymore. At least, not the girl we knew. As I listened, I couldn't help but think about the countless other stories of people who had dabbled with Ouija boards, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. There was something about this case that felt different, though something more tragic, more heartbreaking. Annalise's faith was her refuge, but I wondered if that brief moment of curiosity, that Ouija session in her youth, had set off a chain reaction that no one could have foreseen. Standing outside the church in the fading light, I felt a deep sadness for what had happened to her. Whether her suffering was caused by medical, psychological, or spiritual forces, one thing was clear. Annalise Michel had been haunted by something. Perhaps it was her own mind, or maybe it was something darker, something that had answered her call the night she experimented with that Ouija board. The truth, like so much of her story, remained elusive, lost in the shadows of faith, fear, and tragedy. Chapter 7, The Sally House. My final stop took me to the notorious Sally House in Atchison, Kansas, a small, unassuming brick house that hides a far darker reputation. By now, I was familiar with tales of hauntings, but this one stood apart, particularly because of the events that unfolded after a Ouija board was brought into play. The more I dug into the history of the Sally House, the more I realized that something deeply unsettling had been unleashed here. From the outside, the house looks like any other. It sits quietly in a suburban neighborhood, blending in with its surroundings. But the stories tied to it are anything but ordinary. I'd heard about the experiences of the Pickman family, who lived here in the 1990s. Their story is one of relentless hauntings, an escalating series of events that left them scarred, both physically and emotionally. What many don't realize is that the most violent of these encounters began after they used a Ouija board. The house had already earned a reputation for being haunted. Strange noises, cold spots, and an eerie feeling were common in its history, even before the Pickmans moved in. But once the Ouija board was introduced, the atmosphere seemed to shift in a way that went far beyond typical hauntings. The board wasn't just a tool for communication, it was a door, one that opened wide and let something sinister inside. I'd read through countless first-hand accounts of the Pickman family's experiences, scouring old interviews and written statements. It was clear that before the Ouija board entered the picture, the activity in the house had been unsettling but manageable. Knocks, footsteps, the occasional disembodied voice. But after that fateful night, when they attempted to use the board to communicate with whatever presence was in the house, things took a violent turn. The board spelled out the name Sally, a name the Pickmans had already heard from locals. According to legend, Sally was a little girl who had died in the house after a botched operation. At first, the idea of communicating with a child spirit seemed harmless, even comforting. But as the activity in the house escalated, It became clear that whatever they were dealing with was not the spirit of a child. The Pickmans were caught in a whirlwind of increasingly dangerous events. Furniture moving on its own, scratches appearing on Tony Pickman's body, and a feeling of dread that settled over the house like a dark cloud. As I stood outside the Sally house, the air felt unusually still. It was as if the house was waiting for something. I entered cautiously, walking through the small rooms, each one holding its own uneasy energy. The living room, where the Ouija board session had taken place, felt particularly heavy. The board had acted as a trigger, amplifying whatever forces were already at play in this home. The scratches, the shadows, the attacks, it all started here in this very room. The more I read about the case, the more I was struck by how the Ouija board seemed to be the key that unlocked a deeper level of horror. The Pickmans had faced typical haunted house phenomena before, but after using the board, the activity became physical, even dangerous. Tony Pickman had reported waking up with deep, painful scratches on his arms and back. At times, he would feel an overwhelming sense of anger or fear wash over him, as if something was manipulating his emotions. Objects would move violently across rooms, and their baby's nursery became a hotbed of activity, with toys being thrown and the mobile spinning on its own. I wandered upstairs to the nursery, the room where so much of the terrifying activity had centered. Even years after the Pickmans had left, the room felt wrong. It was cold, even though the rest of the house was warm. The air was thick with an unspoken presence, as if something was watching, waiting. The stories I had read about this room came flooding back, how Tony and Deborah Pickman would hear laughter and footsteps coming from this space, only to find nothing there. The crib had been a particular focus of the activity, with objects moving on their own and strange noises filling the air. But the most chilling aspect of the Sally house was the sense that whatever was here wasn't just a ghost. The Ouija board had opened a line of communication, but it wasn't with the spirit of a young girl named Sally. What had responded seemed far more malevolent, something ancient and cunning, something that thrived on fear and chaos. The board had allowed it to take root, and once it had a foothold, there was no turning back. The Pickman family eventually fled the house, unable to cope with the relentless attacks and the growing sense of danger. But the house remained, and so did whatever had been awakened. Locals still talk about the house, and paranormal investigators continue to visit, hoping to capture evidence of the entities that linger there. Some leave with strange photographs or recordings of unexplained voices, but most leave with the same feeling I had, a sense that the Ouija board had opened a door that could never be closed. I left the Sally house after only a short time, but the experience stayed with me long after I drove away. The Ouija board, for all its simplicity, has proven time and again to be a powerful tool. It can open doors to the unknown, doors that, once opened, cannot easily be shut. In the case of the Sally house, that door led to something dark, something that still lurks in the quiet rooms of that small brick home in Kansas. The Sally house had been my last stop, but it left me with more questions than answers. The Ouija board had been a constant thread throughout my investigations, and in each case, it seemed to serve as a catalyst, a bridge between our world and something far more dangerous. It's easy to dismiss the board as a toy, but after everything I've seen, I know better. The Ouija board is a door, and once you open it, you can't always control what comes through. As we close the chapter on the unsettling history of the Ouija board, I invite you to reflect on what you've discovered. Have you ever had an experience with the board or encountered something you couldn't explain? Your stories are vital to understanding the true nature of these mysteries. Please share your experiences in the comments. Together, we can shed light on the darkness that lingers just beyond our reach.